The night started like any other. I'd been feeling particularly anxious those days, but I chalked it up to the stress of work and life in general. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I brushed it aside and decided to binge-watch a series that plunged me into the lives of people far less complicated than mine. As I settled into my couch, the flickering light from the television turned my small apartment into a transient portal of escape. Yet, it didn't take long for the gnawing sensation in my stomach to return, rippling through me like an uninvited wave crashing on the shore. Around midnight, I went to make myself a cup of tea. The kettle whistled, loud and almost sinister in the silence, but when I poured the boiling water into my cup, something gripped my heart. The feeling of eyes on me. It wasn't an unusual sensation. I often felt watched in this old apartment building. Years of creaking floors and howling winds were enough to imbue a person with paranoia. But tonight was different. I felt an urgency, a cold hand on the nape of my neck. I looked around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. My mind raced with possibilities, but the only things in sight were my cat, Whiskers, lazily licking his paws, and the dim light casting elongated shadows. I shook off the dread and returned to my couch, but sleep eluded me. I decided to check my phone. No new notifications, just a slew of social media posts that filled my mind with worry. I sighed deeply, scrolling through the useless noise of the internet until I noticed a notification from an old friend, the kind you lose touch with but occasionally wonder about. He'd sent an invitation to a group chat, a spontaneous reunion of sorts. Feeling a flicker of excitement amidst my anxiety, I joined. We joked, reminisced, talked about the significant life changes that come when we've all grown up. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like a quiet storm brewing in the distance. I was half-heartedly participating when my phone died. I rolled my eyes and plugged it into the charger, deciding I'd call it a night. But when I tried to sleep, the feeling of dread returned, deeper this time. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, the dim glow from the streetlight outside casting eerie shapes around my room. As if drawn by an unseen force, my eyes darted toward the small window, and everything changed. The shadow, dark yet palpable, swirled and darkened the room. I felt my heart race, thumping against my rib cage like a prisoner trying to escape. I told myself I was imagining things, that fatigue was distorting my reality, but something outside demanded my attention. Gathering my courage, I slowly rose from my bed and crept toward the window. As I approached, my breath hitched in my throat. Outside, clinging to the periphery of the street lamp's glow, stood a figure, faceless and shrouded in darkness. It wore a long coat, tattered and flowing like tattered wings, and yet, I could feel its gaze piercing through the veil of night. My instinct told me to retreat, to leave the shadows behind, but an overwhelming sensation of curiosity anchored me to the spot. As if sensing my presence, the figure turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something that sent shivers down my spine, a hollow smile that didn't belong to any living creature. Suddenly, the air turned stifling, and I felt a pulling sensation at my core, a hunger for something I couldn't comprehend. Panic coursed through me, but moving felt impossible as dread enveloped my senses like a thick fog. I hardly noticed when the ground beneath me began to tremble ever so slightly, vibrating through my feet as the figure beckoned with a crooked finger that seemed to lure me closer. "You seek strength," it whispered, its voice like gravel sliding against steel. My heart raced. How could it know? I hadn't voiced my insecurity to anyone. Discomfort settled deep in my bones, yet I couldn't turn away. Something inside needed to understand. "Strength is born of adversity," it hissed, and in that moment, I was pulled back into memories long buried, the struggles I faced growing up, the bullying, the isolation, the times I fought against the relentless current of life and lost. I gasped, realizing how it laid bare my fears. "Face your fears," the figure commanded, "and you shall uncover what lies beneath." The darkness began to shift and surge around me like a whirlpool, pulling me away from my thoughts and deeper into shadows. I felt my breath quicken, visions swirling before me standing alone in school hallways, grappling with self-doubt and the laughter of others echoing in my mind, moments of being too afraid to speak up for myself, the bleak feeling of belonging nowhere. Each scene tugged at my heart, each instance reminding me of the strength I so often overlooked. The figure lifted its hand, and with a sweeping gesture, the memories condensed into shapes that loomed dark and foreboding. "You have endured," it proclaimed, "and therein lies your strength. Accept it." I felt a surge of warmth amidst the cold dread enveloping me, a flicker of resistance blooming within my chest. I stepped back, confronted by the reflection of my past, a girl too timid to rise against the tide of negativity, chained by insecurities and fear. But as I faced those shadows, something inside me shifted. I gathered my resolve, feeling strength radiating from my core, a flame reborn from the ashes of my struggles. "You are not a victim," I whispered, tears blurring my vision as the shadows began to fade, the figure before me dissolving into wisps of smoke. The night air felt less stifling, my perspective shifted. I wasn't afraid of the darkness anymore. I had the power to overcome it. With one last breath, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders, the sensations of fear replaced with recognition. All those battles I'd faced weren't just scars, they were medals. Medals I could finally wear with pride. And then it was over, the figure was gone, and I stood alone in my room, trembling but somehow stronger. The weight of sleeplessness had vanished, replaced with clarity and purpose. In those fleeting moments, I had touched my strength through adversity, something I could cling on to even as I faced the world outside. The next morning, with the sun streaming through my window, I knew I could embrace whatever lay ahead, leaving the shadows behind but carrying their lessons, a resolve ignited by darkness, revealing the strength I'd always had within. In a cycle of life, we often stumble, but sometimes what feels like the end is merely the beginning of a stronger future. I stepped out into that day, no longer afraid of what people thought or what insecurities whispered into my ear. In retrospect, I often wonder about that night, about that faceless figure and its haunting whispers. Was it real, or was it just a trick of the mind? Regardless, I'd faced a piece of my fear, and that's not something anyone can take away. When I decided to change careers, my journey. When I decided to change careers, it felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into the unknown. I'd been working as a software developer for nearly a decade, and while the job was stable and paid well, it felt like my soul was slowly eroding with every day that passed. My entire adult life, I'd gone through the motions of working, saving, and repeating the cycle, telling myself that stability was everything. I never really questioned the path I was on because, well, it's what you're supposed to do, right? Work hard, build your life, create security for yourself. But lately, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that there was something missing. The long days spent staring at a screen, debugging code, patching systems for bugs I didn't care about, all started to feel like an endless loop of monotony. I kept it to myself for a long time, fearing what people would say if I admitted I wanted out. Friends, family, coworkers, they all expected me to stay put, climb the corporate ladder, eventually make my way to some cushy corner office where I'd be seen as successful. But I couldn't ignore the emptiness any longer. The decision to change careers wasn't an impulsive one, it was like a slow burn that had been building for years. Every morning, as I poured my coffee, I'd feel a sinking feeling in my chest, like I was being drawn into something that wasn't meant for me. Then, one morning, after another late night spent obsessing over job listings, articles on passion careers, and stories of people who left everything behind to pursue their dreams, I realized I couldn't keep lying to myself. I needed a change, and not just a small one. I wanted a fresh start, a path that would make me feel alive again. I didn't know exactly what that looked like, but I had this strange, almost irrational urge to pursue something creative, something where I could work with my hands. I'd always been interested in carpentry, oddly enough. Maybe it was a phase, maybe it was some leftover dream from when I was a kid building things with my dad in the garage, but the idea of working with wood, creating something tangible, felt like a way to reconnect with who I was before life pushed me into tech. It sounded crazy to everyone I told. You want to leave a six-figure salary to become a carpenter? My parents were beside themselves. Friends thought I was kidding. Even my partner thought I was just going through some sort of midlife crisis. But the more resistance I faced, the more determined I felt, like I was defending something precious that no one else could understand. I saved up for a few more months, tightening my spending, and started going to night classes in carpentry after work. The first time I handled a chisel, that rough, raw feeling of cutting into wood, the smell of sawdust filling the air, it was exhilarating. It was so different from the sterile, sanitized world of coding and offices. Here, my mistakes were real, tangible, they couldn't be fixed by a simple backspace or undo command. The wood would split if I wasn't careful, a project could be ruined in an instant, and somehow, that was what drew me in deeper. I was hooked on that feeling of raw creation. I started making small pieces at first, a few shelves, a coffee table. They were rough, far from perfect, but they were mine, created with my hands, and that was enough for me. Soon, people began to notice. A coworker asked if I'd make a table for her. Then a friend wanted a custom bookshelf. Word got around, and suddenly I had orders coming in faster than I could keep up. I was working late into the night, my apartment filled with half-finished projects, tools scattered everywhere. It was chaotic, exhausting, but I was finally doing something that felt right, like I was working towards something real, something I could be proud of. It wasn't long before I reached a crossroads. My manager called me into his office one day, mentioning that I seemed distracted lately, and that if my performance didn't improve, they'd have to reevaluate my position. Part of me wanted to laugh because I already knew what my answer would be. I walked out of that office with my head held high, knowing that I was finally breaking free. Quitting was terrifying, of course. I built my entire life around this idea of security, and here I was, throwing it all away for something that could fail at any moment. I burned my safety net, and there was no going back. But the first morning after I left that job, I felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. No alarm, no dreaded commute, just a quiet calm as I sipped my coffee, knowing I was finally doing something that mattered to me. My little woodworking business started to grow. I rented a tiny workshop, moved all my tools in, and started working full-time. The orders kept coming, and slowly, I gained a reputation for my work. People loved the personal touch I put into each piece, the way every cut, every finish told a story. I learned something else, too. There was a beauty in the imperfections, in the small flaws that made each piece unique. One day, as I was finishing up a dining table for a couple who had driven 3 hours to pick it up, the woman told me it was exactly what they'd been looking for, something handmade, crafted with care. It hit me in that moment that I was doing something meaningful, bringing a small bit of joy into people's lives with something I created with my own 2 hands. It wasn't glamorous, and I wasn't making as much money as I had before, but for the first time, I was truly happy. Looking back, I can't believe I spent so many years afraid to make this change, trapped by the fear of failure, of disappointing others. But now, standing here in my workshop, surrounded by the tools and pieces that make up my new life, I know it was all worth it. This journey taught me that sometimes, you have to take a leap, to risk everything, in order to find yourself again. When I stood up for a cause I believe in, I never imagined it would put me in the crosshairs of something terrifying. It all started on an unremarkable Tuesday, the kind of day where the sun hangs lazily in the sky and the routines of mundane life press ever forward. I was scrolling through various social media feeds when an old friend of mine was live streaming from an animal shelter that had fallen into disrepair. The animals were malnourished, and the building was literally falling apart. Heartbroken, I noticed a group of rallying supporters forming online, determined to raise awareness for the animals who had been rescued and needed homes. Their posts filled my feed, and the passionate cries for help ignited a fire in my gut. Without much thought, I decided to become actively involved, believing fiercely in their cause. I started sharing posts, encouraging people to adopt instead of shop, and organized a small fundraiser, merchandise themed around saving animals, where the profits went directly to the shelter. Bit by bit, the movement gained traction, and people began to show up at the shelter to volunteer, fostering, and adopt. It felt like we were making a difference, that our collective voice was echoing through the community. But just as I felt the warmth of success, a shadow suddenly crept over my enthusiasm. Rumors began swirling about a new owner of the shelter. The former manager, who had mysteriously vanished months prior, was seen lurking around at night, ignoring our signs for help and swatting away our volunteers like flies. I brushed it off initially, thinking they were just stupid urban legends fabricated by bored kids, but the signs began to get weirder. One night, I stayed late to help with a fundraising event, and as I was cleaning up, I saw him, a tall, gaunt figure out of the corner of my eye, creeping along the perimeter of the shelter. My heart raced as he approached, his eyes glimmering with something unidentifiable, something dead. I tried to confront him, but he vanished into the shadowy corners of the building before I could muster a coherent sentence. It unnerved me, but I refused to be discouraged. After all, I was fighting for a cause bigger than myself. Days turned into weeks, and more strange events followed. I started receiving bizarre hate messages on social media, anonymous threats from opposing accounts, accusing me of complicity in animal trafficking and warning me to back off from the shelter. Each message dug deeper than the last, but I was fueled by my commitment, so I counted this as a win for awareness. That's when it reached a boiling point. One night, the shelter was vandalized. Windows were shattered, and heartbreaking images of our beloved animals were spray-painted over the walls. I was furious but also terrified. It was clear now, someone wanted to sabotage our cause. I called an emergency meeting with the other volunteers, and we brainstormed ways to make our movement even bolder. We planned a protest scheduled for a Friday, intending to overshoot our goals. We made signs, chanting, "Save the animals," with voices melding into a roaring sea of hope and determination, but nothing prepared me for the chaos that would soon ensue. I returned from the meeting, planning to rest up. That night, however, I awoke to the sound of scratching outside my window. I thought it was just a stray cat, but when I looked out, my eyes locked onto him, the gaunt figure. Standing right outside my house, his gaze fixated on me, unmoving. Shivers trickled down my spine, and I stumbled back, closing the blinds. The next morning, my heart felt heavier, but I was not going to let fear win. I resolved to bring the fight to the streets, ignited by the thought of helpless animals needing protection. The day of the protest arrived, dozens showed up, united behind our cause. We marched in formation, chanting with conviction, but as we turned onto the corner, something strange happened. The air felt electric, like the atmosphere was charged with dread. Suddenly, from nowhere, a group of individuals in dark hoodies emerged, forming a barrier in front of us. Their leader, a burly man with a wild beard and eyes screaming madness, shouted, "This place is ours. You think you can just come in and take what we built? You'll pay for this." I felt a cold sweat enveloping me. The crowd was anxious now, the unnerving standoff grew thicker with tension, and I found the strength to step forward, yelling, "You don't own these animals. They deserve a chance." My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins as the crowd surged behind me, chanting our mantra louder, more defiantly. But I never expected him to react the way he did. The man pulled a crowbar from his belt and charged at me, shouting obscenities. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching a horror movie unfold but was stuck inside the frame. I ducked just in time, the heavy metal whistling past my ear, only narrowly missing me as I crumpled forward. The crowd erupted in chaos, screams pierced the air as people began to scatter. Amid the panic, I spotted the tall, gaunt figure right behind me, now gifting a chilling smile that sent terror bubbling deep in my gut. "You shouldn't have stood up," he hissed, eyes blazing with malice. Before I could scream, he lunged at me, grabbing a fistful of my shirt just as I felt others beside me fighting him and the crowd vice-grip past us. In the mayhem, I felt my legs give out as I was dragged backward. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, the police began to arrive, sirens blaring, chaotic lights illuminating our park that once embodied freedom. They separated us, and the leaders of the opposing side were cuffed and pulled away, their faces twisted in fury. I was left trembling, full of shock but somehow relieved. Moments later, when I finally caught my breath, it hit me, despite the fears and physical danger, we made an impact. Hours turned into days, and that terrifying encounter transformed into calls for justice. Community support skyrocketed. More media attention came our way, and rather miraculously, the shelter underwent a complete transformation, renovated, revitalized, everything shifting toward positivity. Today, when I stand in front of the shelter, I see a home, an oasis for abandoned animals. And every time I walk through those doors, I remember the price we paid for this sanctuary is a testament of strength. Each time I hear the soft paws patter against the floor, I understand that standing up for what we believe in may cost us everything, but the outcome of courage and love. That is a price worth paying. So when someone asks me if I'd ever do it again, I smile softly and reflect, "You better believe it." The moment I decided to embrace my vulnerability, I had no idea how horrifying it would turn out to be. For years, I wore a mask, expertly crafted to hide my insecurities and fears, projecting an image of the perfect, confident person. On the outside, I was the life of the party, the one who inspired others with motivational quotes and endless optimism, but on the inside, I was a trembling mass of anxiety and doubt. It was the summer of my 29th year when everything began to unravel. I had been invited to a weekend retreat in the woods, meant to be a therapeutic and bonding experience for a group of people struggling with their own issues. At first, I thought about skipping it, the idea of sharing my vulnerabilities with strangers was terrifying. But then I remembered a quote I had read, something about how growth starts at the end of your comfort zone. Feeling determined, and perhaps a little reckless, I packed my bag and hit the road. The retreat was held in a remote cabin, miles away from any city lights or cell phone reception. We arrived at dusk, the sky bleeding orange and pink, and for a moment, I felt something akin to freedom. The others seemed welcoming, some were laughing, others shy, but all were eager to share their stories. It was heartwarming, until I was prompted to speak. The first few people shared, and I listened, enraptured by their confessions. They talked about loss, failed relationships, childhood trauma, and for the first time in my life, I felt a pang of connection, like I was on the brink of something profound. So, I stood up, heart pounding, eyes simultaneously blazing and terrified. But when I finally opened my mouth, the words that tumbled out were jumbled and raw. I'm not as strong as I pretend to be. Almost immediately, the weight of my admission crashed down on me. Instead of receiving the understanding I had hoped for, I felt a suffocating silence wrap around the group. I looked at their faces, and one woman named Jenna caught my gaze, her expression wavering between sympathy and something darker. The atmosphere shifted, and a pervading sense of discomfort bubbled up. I hurriedly sat down, feeling exposed and foolish. The rest of the evening passed in awkward murmurs and exchanged glances, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought a shadow into the room. Later that night, while everyone else was asleep, I wandered outside. The stars were bright, a sharp contrast to the silence that enveloped the woods. I needed to get away from myself, to escape the embarrassment I felt from the gathering. Just as I turned to head back, I noticed a flickering light coming from the edge of the woods. My curiosity piqued, I moved toward it. As I approached, I saw a small fire surrounded by a few silhouettes. It was then that I recognized them, those who had been hesitant to share during the meeting, their faces lit by the glowing embers. They were whispering among themselves, and I felt a pang of regret for retreating so quickly. But as I stood there, straining to listen, the whispers turned into frantic discussions, and suddenly, I understood I had stumbled upon something sinister. "It's like they don't even care," I heard Jenna hiss, her tone sharp. "They don't realize the danger." My heart raced. What were they discussing? I felt like a voyeur intruding on something sacred, and yet, I couldn't pull myself away. "You think they'll come for us?" another voice asked, trembling. "They always do," Jenna said, a shiver of dread creeping into her words. I crouched low, panic coursing through my veins like ice. What danger? I strained to catch more of their conversation, when suddenly, a snapping twig echoed through the woods. My heart lurched, and I held my breath, unsure if they had heard it too. The figures turned, their faces obscured by shadows, as whispers turned into silence. I knew I had to leave, but my legs felt like lead. Just as I stood to back away, a voice broke through the quiet. "Why are you eavesdropping?" It was Jenna, her eyes glinting in the darkness, horror etched across her face. Caught, I stammered for a response, and before I could utter a word, Jenna's expression shifted to something fierce and wild. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, do you?" She sneered, and I could feel danger lacing her words. I glanced around, desperate for an escape, but before I could turn, she took a step toward me, raising her arm to silence whatever response I might offer. "This retreat is a trap, designed not to heal, but to dig deeper into your fears," she hissed. "They use vulnerability against you." Her words struck like lightning, and each revelation shrouded in fear began to resonate within me. "What do you mean?" I squeaked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The rest of them." Jenna scoffed, a harsh laugh escaping her lips. "They don't want to hear your pain, they want to consume it. They read your story and turn it into something monstrous. It's a predatory circle. The more they know, the more they can manipulate." The firelight behind her crackled ominously, casting dancing shadows as her words sank in. I blinked back, confusion and dread, my mind racing through the implications. If everything I had shown was a part of this web, then by admitting my vulnerability, I'd only opened the door to my own annihilation. Tentatively, I took one step back, but that only seemed to galvanize Jenna even further. "You think you can just run? No. They will find you, and you'll be swallowed whole." Adrenaline surged through me, and I turned on my heel, sprinting back toward the cabin, the thumping of my heart beating a war drum in my ears. I burst inside, the warmth colliding with the chill of my fear, and I slammed the door behind me, seeking refuge. But the comfort of four walls was a facade. Shadows lurked in every corner, and I could feel eyes watching me, dissecting me. I crept to my room, trying to convince myself that it was all a lie, that vulnerability isn't a path to destruction. But every sound felt amplified, the wind howled, the trees creaked, and the very silence rang with the foreboding of what lurked outside. The next day, amidst my paranoia, I tried to blend in, acting as if nothing had happened. But Jenna was gone. The others quickly noticed her disappearance, manifesting worry and concern, and I felt a pang of guilt slicing through my resolve. Had I put her in danger? I kept my fears to myself, analyzing the group that had seemed so friendly, but now appeared as a horde of predators. But imposing a facade is a tiring task. I felt the churning pit of disquiet grow within me. When night fell, the others gathered again around the campfire, a sense of somber dread edging into the atmosphere. It was a chance for vulnerability, they said, to share in their collective pain. But as each unguarded moment passed, I sat frozen, heart thumping viscously as I watched the transformation, the others looking more ravenous after each story was shared. As each tear fell, I sensed a change glossing over them, a competition of emotional consumption unfolding before my eyes. Tonight, I would refuse. Refuse to be fodder, refuse to be consumed. When my turn came, they asked me to share, and I simply sat, determined not to offer my secrets. Instead, I raised my voice against their expectation, confronting them softly at first. Do you hear how you all tremble? How you wait hungrily for my wounds? Then tougher, vulnerability shouldn't be a tool for exploitation. They looked at me, some surprised, some angry, and there was a palpable shift, a wave of tension rippling as they realized I posed a threat that night. That's when their true natures emerged. The smiles fell, replaced with strained expressions, and I could feel the shift in intentions. They were no longer peers in this journey of healing, they were wolves waiting for the final sacrifice. I had stepped into a den and started pulling at threads I should have left unraveled. I bolted for the door when their voices rose. You think you can just reject us? You're nothing, one yelled. You'll be sorry, another growled. The group closed in, faces twisted with anger and hunger, and while the forest could have swallowed me whole, I knew I had to escape. I burst into the wilderness just as the shadows lunged, and my legs moved faster than they ever had before. Branches reached out like claws, the chill of the woods nibbling at my exposed flesh, and it was like an animal chase, instincts kicking in while the haunting laughter grew distant but remained persistent in the dark. I was running not only for my life but for my very soul, the very essence that might lay bare if I ever handed them my vulnerability. When I finally crashed into the clearing, I could hear nothing but the blood rushing in my ears. With desperation, I turned, seeking some semblance of safety as I stumbled back toward the main road where a car might spot me. As I reached my car, breathless and shaken, a figure stepped from behind a tree, a familiar silhouette that froze my blood. You shouldn't have run, Jenna said, stepping forward, her face rendered in shadow. You think they accepted weakness? No, but weakness makes a tasty meal. I pleaded for her to come with me, but she shook her head. I'm not strong, she murmured, a sad smile touching her lips. You have to be brave enough to survive, but you must forego your vulnerability completely. I felt the tears fill my eyes as I understood the chilling weight of her advice. I sped off, leaving the retreat behind, burnt with the knowledge that what I had sought, a caring community, was nothing more than a pack of wolves masquerading as fellow travelers. The horrifying realization cut deep. Vulnerability wasn't a beautiful journey toward connection, it was a gamble, and sometimes one with sinister outcomes. Today, I carry not just my scars but a shield forged from that fateful weekend. Lessons and tragic stories woven into resilience. I now understand that embracing vulnerability isn't always about sharing, but rather knowing whom to trust, when to flee, and recognizing that not all wolves wear sheep's clothing, some are merely shadows lurking in the darkness, waiting to consume the very essence of your open heart. So, be careful when you tread along the delicate paths of vulnerability, for there are those who would devour more than just stories. They want your soul, your truth, your very light. This was my brave step into the darkness, my lesson learned, but now I walk differently, a survivor in a world ever shadowed by those waiting to feast.
I bought a used car, a dusty old sedan that had seen better days, but it was a steal, a cherry red classic with character, and the minute I turned the key in the ignition, I felt a thrill run down my spine. Maybe I was romanticizing it a bit, after all, I was on a tight budget, but there was something about the way it hummed a life that felt like the beginning of an adventure, so I drove it home. The stench of worn leather and spilled coffee wafting through the cracked windows. And that's when the GPS came to my attention. I had barely explored the different features before it pinged to life, an inane mechanical voice buzzing through the speaker. Proceed to the highlighted route, and I brushed it off as a quirky residual feature from the previous owner. But when I glanced at the screen to input my address, I noticed a saved location, ominously labeled home. Curiosity pricked at me, and I hesitated before I selected it, thinking it would lead me to some forgotten spot that the previous owner was too busy to clear out. But the route it displayed took me in the opposite direction of my house, straight into a neighborhood I didn't recognize. I told myself to ignore it, but it gnawed at me. Who came here and why? And more importantly, why did I feel a shiver of dread crawl up my spine as I turned onto that ominous road? I became obsessed, almost entranced, and before I knew it, I was driving towards that destination as if under a spell, eerie clouds gathering overhead as the late afternoon sun dipped away, and with every passing block, the houses grew more dilapidated, their paint peeling like forgotten dreams, the air heavy with the scent of decay, and it was cruelly quiet, not even the chirp of a distant bird to shatter the oppressive silence that loomed. As the GPS blurted out the upcoming turn, I felt a fleeting doubt, should I really go through with this? But the thought of turning back seemed far worse, and I pressed on, driven by some uncontrollable desire to know what lay at the end of this journey. My heart thumped in rhythm with the sound of my tires meeting cracked pavement, the bright screen guiding me deeper into the unknown, finally directing me to a small, abandoned house at the end of a tree-choked lane. The GPS chirped, "You have arrived," but my pulse quickened, and I turned off the engine, staring at the crumbling structure bathed in the dying light. Creeping out of my car, I was drawn closer, an almost magnetic pull surging through me as I approached the front door, a door that swung open as if welcoming me, revealing a darkness painted thick across the interior. I could almost hear my mom's voice echoing in my head, warning me against strange places, but still, I stepped inside. The door creaked behind me, slamming shut with a finality that clawed at my throat, and then, it hit me, there were items strewn about, old newspapers gathering dust, and a single, flickering bulb above casting an eerie glow over a relic of a forgotten life. In the far corner, a child's red tricycle lay abandoned, rust eating into the metal frame, and I turned to leave, that feeling of dread morphing into a palpable urge to flee. But that's when I noticed it, a family photo on the wall, a crooked frame shielding a moment frozen in time. I studied it, and icy tendrils of horror snaked through my gut as I recognized the faces smiling back at me, the previous owner, their spouse, and a little boy whose happy eyes struck a chord of dread within me. No, 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 I stammered, retracing the steps of my mind, until, like clockwork, my memories caught up with me, the names of the children at my school echoing in my mind. This boy was Billy, the one who disappeared 2 years ago, the one whose face haunted the local news. A chill wrapped around my spine as I struggled to comprehend the horrifying connection, and that's when the GPS buzzed back to life with a shrill beep. New destination set, home. But I was glued to the spot in horror, and suddenly the once familiar hum of the engine felt like a distant nightmare. That's when I noticed the shadows in the corners of the room, watching, waiting, something shifting as whispers began to crawl through the air. Beyond a doorway that led to a darkened cellar beneath the house, my heart galloped now, and I was prepared to bolt out of there when I heard the soft giggle of a child, pure innocent laughter that sent a jolt through my very soul, and it echoed from beneath the floorboards. Instincts screamed at me to flee, but my feet betrayed me, drawing me towards that sound. With trembling hands grabbing at the basement door handle, I forced it open, revealing a staircase spiraling into the darkness below. Each step down felt like a leap into another dimension, and as I reached the bottom, my breath caught. There, huddled in the dark, was a small figure. It was him, Billy, frozen in time, staring wide-eyed, his little face smeared with dirt as he whispered, "They keep asking me to play. Will you play with us?" Terror flooded my senses, my heart racing as shadows danced around him, a group of small children standing in the corners of the room, their eyes hollow and bodies swaying like specters, and before I could respond, I felt the icy touch of something cold wrap around my ankle, pulling me deeper into their ethereal realm. I fought back, screaming for help, but it seemed lost in the ever-thickening air, and the last thing I remember was the GPS announcing, "Destination set, home," but it wasn't mine anymore.
I never liked being alone. As a child, I would cry when left in my room for even a few minutes, and as a teenager, I sought the company of friends like a drowning sailor grasps at a life buoy. It wasn't until last summer, after I moved to a small coastal town seeking some semblance of peace, that everything changed. Initially, the solitude felt crushing, the silence of my tiny apartment echoed in my ears, and I regretted leaving my bustling city life behind. The first few nights were the hardest. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rustle of the wind and the distant crash of waves, wishing for someone, anyone, to share it with. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to adapt. I found a routine: morning walks along the beach, afternoons spent in a local cafe, evenings filled with books I had long neglected. It was during these solitary walks that I began to see things differently. One cloudy afternoon, I stumbled upon an old shipwreck half buried in the sand, its skeletal remains silhouetted against the gray sky. Curious, I wandered closer, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and wonder. As I explored the wreck, brushing off barnacles and examining the twisted metal, I felt a strange connection to the lost vessel. It had weathered storms, endured unspeakable hardships, and yet here it remained, resilient and hauntingly beautiful. I lingered there, captivated by the forlorn ship as waves lapped at its hull, and for the first time, I found solace in my own company. Days turned into weeks, and my fascination with the shipwreck deepened. I started sketching it in the soft light of dawn, pouring my emotions into every line and shade. My art was raw, unpolished, but it felt like a release. I painted the ship with vibrant colors, bringing it back to life in my imagination. It became a symbol of solitude for me, an embodiment of strength, survival, and beauty found in decay. One night, I decided to photograph the ship at sunset. The sky blazed with hues of orange and pink, casting a mystical glow over the wreck. As I clicked the shutter, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement among the shadows. I squinted into the dim light, my heart racing, and saw a figure standing by the ship. A woman, clothed in flowing white, her hair wild and untamed by the wind. My breath hitched in my throat. I ducked behind a nearby rock, unsure if this was just a figment of my imagination or something more sinister. I thought about running, but an inexplicable urge to stay anchored me to the spot. I watched as she danced, a strange, haunting ballet right there on the beach, illuminated by the dying sun. I couldn't take my eyes off her. The rhythmic ebb and flow of her movements seemed to mirror the waves, an otherworldly grace that filled the void of my solitude. Just when I thought I couldn't possibly stare any longer, she turned, gazing directly into my hiding place. My heart raced as I prepared to flee, but instead, she smiled, a soft, ethereal smile that felt like an invitation. I hesitated. She beckoned with a faint motion of her hand, and against all logic, I stepped out from behind the rock. The moment our eyes locked, something shifted within me. It was as if she could see into the depths of my soul, sensing all the loneliness I had harbored for so long. "Have you come to join me?" she asked, her voice melodic and soothing, carrying over the sound of crashing waves. I nodded, stepping closer, feeling a warmth that pushed away the chill of the evening. She took my hand and led me to the shipwreck, and for hours, we danced under the stars, lost in our own world. The night felt alive, vibrant in a way I had never experienced before. We shared stories, her life woven with travel and adventure, mine filled with fear and hesitation. She spoke of the freedom and solitude, how it had allowed her to discover who she truly was. As dawn broke, I realized I had experienced something magical, something that changed the very fabric of who I was. But as the sunlight spilled over the horizon, I turned to her, and she was gone, leaving only the imprint of her presence in the sand where we had danced. I stood there, breathless and bewildered, the weight of her words lingering in my mind. That single night transformed my understanding of solitude. It was no longer a prison, it was an invitation to explore, to create, and to embrace the beauty of silence. Instead of isolating me, it offered a canvas upon which I could paint my own identity. I returned to the shipwreck every day, sketching tirelessly, lost in my art, and each time, I felt her spirit watching over me, guiding my hand. As the weeks passed, I began to meet locals who frequented the beach, joining them in their small gatherings. I found a sense of community blossoming around me, yet in that community, I discovered the joy of solitude. I no longer feared moments alone, instead, I cherished them, filling them with creativity and reflection. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the beach, surrounded by newfound friends, sharing laughter and stories. A gentle breeze caressed my face, and I felt her presence beside me, an unbreakable bond forged from a simple night of dancing. I closed my eyes, realizing that I had truly learned to appreciate solitude. It wasn't the absence of others that had transformed me, it was the profound connection I had found within myself in those moments of quiet reflection. I stood, gazing out at the glittering ocean, grateful for how far I had come. The shipwreck remained my sanctuary. In the end, I learned that solitude is not something to fear, it can be a source of strength, inspiration, and connection to the world around us. Even in moments of isolation, there's beauty to be found, the kind that can illuminate the darkest corners of our hearts and fill our souls with light. When my kids stood up for me, a lesson in courage. When my kids stood up for me, a lesson in courage. It was a late evening when the incident happened, one that started off so ordinarily that I never could have imagined it would turn into a nightmare. My 8-year-old son, Jack, and I had just finished dinner. He was busy building a Lego tower at the kitchen table while I washed dishes, the sound of water splashing over plates mingling with his cheerful humming. Life hadn't been easy lately. As a single parent juggling a stressful job and raising a kid on my own, every day felt like a marathon, but we were getting by, and Jack's laughter made everything worth it. The quiet comfort of our evening was abruptly shattered by a loud, aggressive pounding on the front door. I froze, the soapy dish slipping from my hands into the sink with a clatter. Jack's humming stopped, and he looked up, wide-eyed. We exchanged a silent, worried glance before I wiped my hands on a towel and cautiously approached the door. My heart was already racing, a sense of foreboding settling in my chest. "Who is it?" I called, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. There was a moment of silence, and then a rough, unfamiliar voice answered, "Open the door. We need to talk." The tone sent chills down my spine. I peeked through the peephole and saw 2 men standing on the porch, both dressed in dark, rumpled clothes with hardened expressions. They didn't look like anyone I knew, and they certainly didn't seem friendly. I swallowed hard and turned back to Jack, who was now clutching a Lego piece in his small hand, his face pale. "Stay here," I whispered to him, and he nodded, eyes wide with worry. I cracked the door open just enough to face the men. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice wavering. The taller man, who had a jagged scar running down his left cheek, stepped forward. "We're here about a debt," he said, his eyes narrowing. My stomach twisted. "A debt?" I had no idea what he was talking about. "I think you have the wrong person," I replied, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. The second man, stockier and wearing a stained baseball cap, sneered. "No mistake," he said. "We know you live here. Your name is on our list." Panic surged through me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what they could possibly mean. Sure, money was always tight, but I didn't owe anyone anything that would warrant a visit like this. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, starting to close the door, but the taller man slammed his hand against it, stopping me. My breath hitched, and Jack let out a small, frightened whimper from behind me. The men noticed, and the taller one's gaze shifted past me, landing on Jack. "Nice kid you got there," he drawled. My protective instincts kicked in, and I stepped fully in front of the door, blocking Jack from their view. "Leave now, or I'm calling the police," I threatened, but the words felt hollow. The men exchanged a look, clearly not intimidated. "Go ahead," the one with the baseball cap said. "By the time they get here, it'll be too late." I could feel my hands trembling. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, the realization that I couldn't physically protect my son from these men. But then, something extraordinary happened. Jack, who had been silent and scared, stepped forward, clutching his Lego tower in his hands. His small voice rang out, surprisingly steady. "You leave my mom alone?" he said, his little body standing as tall as he could manage. The men turned their attention to him, and for a moment, the tension seemed to freeze, the air thick with disbelief. "What did you say, kid?" the scarred man asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Jack's chin wobbled, but he held his ground, his eyes fierce. "I said, leave her alone." He repeated, louder this time. His voice trembled at the edges, but his courage was undeniable. In that instant, a fire lit within me. Seeing my son stand up to these men, even when he was clearly terrified, snapped me out of my fear. I took a deep breath, feeling a surge of determination. "You heard him," I said, my voice steady for the first time. "Get off my property. Now." The men looked taken aback, and for a split second, I saw doubt flicker across their faces. Maybe they hadn't expected resistance, or maybe they were thrown off by the fierce defiance of an 8-year-old. Whatever it was, it gave me the strength to hold my ground. Jack stepped closer to me, his little hand reaching out to grab mine, and I squeezed it tightly. "We're not going anywhere," the scarred man snapped, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "You have 5 seconds to leave," I said, pulling out my phone and starting to dial. I was bluffing about how fast the police would come, but I hoped the sight of me making the call would be enough. The two men hesitated, and then, to my immense relief, they backed off. "This isn't over," the man with the baseball cap spat, but they turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the street. I slammed the door shut, bolting it and leaning against it as my legs threatened to give out. My whole body was shaking, but I felt a rush of pride and awe as I looked at Jack. His face crumpled, and he started to cry, the adrenaline giving way to the terror he had felt. I scooped him up into my arms, holding him tightly. "You were so brave," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so proud of you." We stayed like that for a while, clinging to each other in the aftermath of the horror we had just faced. Later, once the police had come and gone, taking our statements and promising to increase patrols in the area, Jack and I sat together on the couch. He was still a little shaky, but he looked up at me with wide, earnest eyes. "Mom," he said, "I was really scared." I stroked his hair, my heart aching with love. "I know, sweetheart," I said, "but you stood up anyway. That's what being brave means." He thought about that for a moment, then nodded, a small smile breaking through the fear. That night, as I tucked Jack into bed, I realized that he had taught me something profound. Courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about standing up even when fear feels overwhelming. My son, my sweet, small son, had shown me the kind of strength that can only come from love. And that, I knew, would always be enough to keep us going, no matter what came next. I never believed in fate until that chilly October evening when I had an inspiring conversation with a stranger that would alter my entire perception of life. It was just a regular night, the kind that fades into the background of a busy week. I had settled into my usual routine after work, trudging past the mundane city blocks toward a cramped cafe that had the best coffee but was low on everything else: ambience, seating, and, most importantly, inspiration. As I pushed through the glass door, a burst of warmth enveloped me, briefly easing my weariness. I ordered my coffee, took a seat at a small table near the back, and tried to focus on my phone, scrolling through mundane social media feeds that only deepened my sense of isolation. Looking around, I noticed the usual suspects: a couple in the corner, their heads together as they giggled and whispered, a group of laptop warriors tapping away in silence, and an old man at the front, deep in a newspaper, seemingly oblivious to the rest of the world. I sighed, feeling a swelling nostalgia for the days when human connection came easily. Just as I was about to drown my existential crisis in caffeine, a stranger entered the cafe. He was tall and gaunt, with disheveled gray hair and a black coat that looked as if it hadn't seen a good wash in years. He shuffled to the counter, ordered a cup of herbal tea, and, for reasons entirely unclear to me, he didn't seem unaware of the stares he was drawing. There was something magnetic about him, his presence seeming to disrupt the usual dynamics of the cafe, almost as if he had materialized from a different time, and in a way, I felt drawn to him. I fidgeted in my seat, the silence stretching uncomfortably around me. To my surprise, he walked over to my table, holding his tea with shaking fingers. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly soft, yet tinged with an unmistakable intensity. I nodded, instantly intrigued, curious what depths lay beneath those tired eyes. As he sat down, I couldn't help but notice small things: the scar on his hand, the deep lines marking his face like pages in a well-worn book. "You look like someone who's been searching for something," he said, his gaze steady and unwavering. My heart raced. It was true, I had been searching for a reason to break through my life's monotony. I was a 20-something living in a large city, working a job I didn't love, and spending my evenings wrapped in solitude, trying to find meaning while endlessly scrolling my phone. The conversation quickly deepened. He introduced himself as Harold and spoke of his life in a way that was both raw and poetic. He had traveled to countless countries, taken risks that left indelible marks on his soul, and even experienced love and loss that taught him profound lessons. What struck me the most was how he described these moments, each one laden with meaning, the way he spoke of sunsets on remote beaches as not just gorgeous sights, but as a reminder to appreciate brevity. He recounted a tale of climbing a mountain at dawn, realizing that the grueling climb had forged bonds with strangers that would last a lifetime. I found myself lost in his stories, each one resonating with a part of me that I had buried beneath the routine sameness of my life. What do you search for? I asked, suddenly aware that I was still staring directly at him, hungry for more. He paused for a moment, looking out the cafe window at the bustling streets outside filled with people rushing home after long days. Connection, he said finally, turning his eyes back to mine, that elusive thread that binds us all. His response hung in the air like a charge. I was captivated, desperate to understand everything he was saying. He spoke of deep connection not just with other people, but with nature, art, and even ourselves. At one point, he leaned closer and added, "You see, we hide from each other. We're terrified to reach out, afraid of rejection, judgment, yet it is in those moments we must take the leap." He challenged me to push beyond the immediate safety of my shell, suggesting I would never truly know what I could achieve until I embraced the vulnerability of forging deeper connections. I had never thought of it that way. I always believed introspection and solitude were paths to understanding myself better. But Harold painted a contrasting vision, that true growth comes from relationships, from moments shared with others, even with strangers like him. As we talked, I felt a tingling sensation of hope. I opened up about my own experiences, sharing my dreams, my fears, and my insecurities. To my surprise, he didn't judge or dismiss my concerns. Instead, he listened intently, his expression unwavering and empathetic. We drifted in and out of topics, from existential musings to the most trivial observations about life, connecting with every sentence, challenging each other's views while forming an unspoken bond. Hours passed as if we had lost control of time. Eventually, the barista began cleaning up, signaling the cafe was about to close. A slight wave of panic washed over me at the thought of losing this connection. I wasn't ready for it to end. "Harold," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "I don't know if I'll ever meet someone like you again." He smiled knowingly, a soft sparkle in his eyes. "You will. But the key is to keep looking and remain open to experiences." As the cafe emptied, he pulled out a small piece of paper and scribbled his email address, handing it to me with a meaningful look. "Reach out, share your journey. I'll be here, ready to listen." It felt like a promise and a challenge all at once. I thanked him, feeling a rush of gratitude for this serendipitous encounter. With a lingering warmth in my heart, I watched as he gripped his cup, standing to leave. Each step toward the exit felt heavy with the weight of unspoken words, yet I knew this wouldn't be the end. Harold turned back one last time, his eyes locking with mine as if sharing an unbreakable bond. "No matter how lost you feel, never forget to seek connection. It's what fuels the soul." And with that, he stepped out into the night, disappearing among the throngs of people. I sat there for a while, still reeling, until the chill of the room shook me from my reverie. I left the cafe, the city streets alive with energy around me, feeling strangely buoyant, even liberated. I couldn't shake the thought swirling inside my mind. I realized I had never truly been alone, but rather guarding myself against the beauty and pain that connections could bring. That encounter transformed my perspective, unlocking a desire to engage with the world. Since that night, I have made it a point to connect with others, striking up conversations with strangers, sharing laughter, and finding warmth in human stories. I often wonder about Harold, if our paths will cross again, or if he's forever wandering, inspiring others as he did me. Regardless, I carry his message in my heart, that in the vast tapestry of humanity, connection is what we all seek, perhaps the greatest adventure of all.
I never thought much of the feeling, that tickle of paranoia that crawls up your spine, until it became a reality I couldn't ignore. It started innocently enough with me walking home from work one late evening, the streets eerily quiet, the glow of the street lamps bleeding into pools of darkness that shifted menacingly with each step I took. At first, I dismissed it. Who wouldn't feel a twinge of unease in the dimness, the world stripped of its color and sound? But soon the feeling morphed into something far more tangible. I caught sight of a shadow just beyond the periphery of my vision, always there, always lingering. In the beginning, I turned around, heart racing, only to be met with the usual scene of desolation, the empty street mocking my unease with its silence. Rationality dictated my thoughts. "It's just a trick of the lighting, you're being paranoid." But as the days stretched on and I walked that same route home, the feeling intensified, each night a game of cat and mouse, my pulse quickening whenever I dared to look back. I began to dread those moments when our paths would almost cross, when the blurry outline of a figure in a hoodie would materialize from the darkness, just far enough away to remain indistinct, yet close enough to let me know I wasn't just imagining things. As the fear seeped deeper, I confided in friends, but their laughter only stoked the flames of my anxiety. They couldn't see what I saw, or perhaps they simply didn't believe me, and each instance of their disbelief drove me further into isolation, the feeling of being stalked edging me closer to the brink of madness. I took to changing my route, making detours and doubling back, but to no avail. It was as if the thing following me had a cruel sense of humor, always adapting, always there, lurking just beyond the light, its movements synchronized with my own. My sleepless nights piled on like bricks, crushing me under their weight. I began to question my sanity, staring into the mirror with red-rimmed eyes filled with both fear and a desperate plea for understanding. Please, someone else must see this, I can't be the only one. Then one fateful evening, as autumn winds whipped leaves into spirals and the air turned crisp, I felt an odd compulsion to face my pursuer head-on. Adrenaline surged as I conjured every ounce of courage, turning swiftly to confront the figure trailing me this time, only to find nothing. The world felt static for a heartbeat, the silence pregnant with tension until a shiver raced through me. There was something wrong here, a gnawing realization that the figure had never truly been there. My mind whipped through the implications like a movie on fast forward. I felt it then, a sudden chill sweeping through the alley, and as I spun around, lightning crashed in the distance, illuminating a figure just behind me. It stood there, grinning wide like it belonged to a storybook nightmare, features unnaturally smooth and eyes filled with a predatory glint. As my breath hitched, I was flooded with the certainty that this ghastly apparition had been my relentless shadow all along, its joy gleefully pulsing in rhythm with my rising terror, reveling in the fear it had thrived off of for days, no, weeks, maybe longer. It was like I had finally become part of its twisted game. Panic surged as I turned to flee, my body moving on instinct, the echo of its laughter ringing in my ears, taunting me as the air thickened with despair. I raced through the streets, darting into the nearest cafe, my heart pounding as I slammed the door behind me. I turned, gasping for a breath, and my eyes scanned the dimly lit space, but the comforting presence of the barista and a few early morning patrons did little to soothe the raw panic gripping my chest. I needed reassurance, I needed someone to believe me, and yet, as I opened my mouth to explain how I felt, how there was something hellish stalking me, the words caught in my throat. They would just see a frightened lunatic, wouldn't they? So I sat there, clutching my coffee cup, listening to the mundane conversations around me while the certainty of that thing lingered just outside, never truly vanishing. Every moment stretched impossibly, time morphing into something grotesque as I became aware that the space I occupied and the life I led was increasingly detached from reality. I could almost hear it whispering my name, an echo of my own voice layered with that unearthly mirth. I stayed frozen there, cursing my own cowardice until finally, with shaking hands, I pulled out my phone. Perhaps the digital lifeline would offer me solace, and I sought solace in scrolling through social media until I stumbled onto a thread about sleep paralysis, and I froze as I read the accounts. It was happening to others, stories of figures that no one else could see, sinister entities designed to torment, each one creeping into their lives just as it had crowded into mine. I was both relieved and horrified, realizing I wasn't alone in this nightmare, yet the thought that I could be losing my grasp on sanity turned my exhilaration to terror once more. The realization flushed through me, I had become part of their game. I hastily shared my story, hoping to find that someone, somewhere could help me understand, help me escape, but all I found were more questions, more users insisting I needed to seek immediate psychological help. As I sat in that cafe, the mist outside turned thick and strange, shadows pressing against the graffiti-marked windows, and the laughter faded into something darker. The patrons became blurs, mere characters in my own horror story, transfixed by their lives while I withered beneath the weight of the thing that haunted me. When the barista finally called for last orders, I blinked into the dim light of the cafe, and then I noticed it. The creature from the corner of my eye was no longer hidden in the shadows, it was at the window, staring straight at me, the grin stretching wider, impossibly expanding, thickening the tragic air, twisting my stomach into icy knots as my heart thudded against my ribs. I needed to leave, to escape, but as I stumbled to my feet, I caught the reflection of the ghastly figure in the glass. And in that perfect, warped moment, as I realized it was mimicking my every move, I understood that it didn't want me to run. It wanted me to stay, to drown in the eerie reality it had constructed just for me, to embrace the fact that I was utterly lost to this thing, this relentless tormentor, who had found the perfect prey in a mind crumbling under the weight of sanity, forever bound in a dance neither of us could escape. With a battle cry lodged firmly in my throat, I fled into the night, my thoughts a vortex of terror, tackling the cold air as I ran, not for safety, but into the dark embrace where only one of us would emerge victorious.